Hello and welcome back to day 2 of Devex at COP26. I'm Kate Warren here with UK correspondent Will Worley. We're coming to you from the Blue Zone, which is where all of the official meetings are taking place, a wide range of side events, all kinds of activity happening here. We're actually in the action zone, you could say, in the heart of the action. But excited to kick off today's program. We'll be bringing you some conversations with some of the leaders that are here today. Before we get started, just a quick note, if you are joining via Zoom, there is access to interpretation in French and Spanish, as well as closed captioning. You can access that at the bottom of the screen. I do want to thank our partners who made this coverage possible. So we have our Innovation and Ecosystem Partner, DAI UK, as well as ecosystem partners, AGRA, Catapult, Center for Disease Protection, ESRI, and RTI International, and our underwriter, FHI 360. So thank you for your support. But Will, we're here in the Action Zone. There's all kinds of side events, activities happening, but even outside of here, there are other events, that we've been learning about day by day. There's a biodiversity summit happening today. There was a separate climate summit earlier this week, all kinds of private dinners, events. Do you get a sense that all this activity is a good thing and is helping to make progress, or that there are maybe a lot of different siloed conversations and people are kind of not necessarily talking with each other, but side by side?
I think it depends on who you speak to and who will people will have a lot of different takes on it. There is the impression that COP is a coming together of many different minds, and people naturally fall into different interests, but it's also about making different kind of connections across spheres. It's probably quite difficult to tell how all these different groups are working together and what connections will be made. Many of those will not necessarily be public, but it's interesting to note that there's also been a lot of announcements and sectoral agreements from governments, from institutions, kind of almost in parallel to what's been going on in the negotiations itself, and those announcements alone have kept everybody very, very busy.
Right, and so, last night the cover text of the agreement came out. Can you talk a little bit about what that means, what that is, for our audience is not as familiar with how the COP proceedings go, and any early impressions on that?
Sure. So this is basically the first draft of the agreement. That will be the kind of the Glasgow agreement. So it's a pretty wide-ranging text, but it's also important to note there are still 3 days left to go. This is what everything is going to be. It's all going to be fought over. There's about 200 parties here, almost 200 parties, excuse me. So that's a lot of different interests kind of competing for what they want in it. So the language, as we see it now, which is available online, will not be the same by the end of the week. But there were a lot of different points in that. There's been a call particularly for annual climate pledges. So instead of coming together for renewed climate ambition every 5 years, many countries want to see that happen on a more annual basis for increased ambition. But of most relevance to Devex viewers is probably the point on adaptation finance. There has been a big uptake of adaptation finance on the agenda at this COP. The cover text notes with serious concern that the current provision of climate finance for adaptation is insufficient to respond to the worsening climate change impacts in developing country parties, and it calls for more financing for adaptation. A second really important point, I think, is also loss and damage. Now, there was a whole section dedicated to loss and damage in this text, which is really important, but also the language compared to especially some of what we saw on adaptation financing, the language is pretty weak, and a lot of people won't be especially happy with that, and who knows how that's going to look by the end of the week.
Yeah, so today we will be having discussions on carbon trading, on climate and tech, but we're also bringing some conversations with some of the leaders that are here in the room that are actively part of these discussions and negotiations. So what are some of the conversations you're looking forward to today?
I'm looking forward to speaking with Hindu Umuru Ibrahim, who is an indigenous rights activist from Chad. I think she's going to be fascinating. I think everyone at home will be really interested to hear what she has to say. Salim ul Haq, who is also very much involved, very vocal climate justice advocate from Bangladesh. He heads up a think tank unit there. But we've also got some leaders coming up, Priti Sinha from the UN CDF, the UN Capital Development Fund, talking more to the financial piece. And we have Asif Saleh, head of BRAC, the largest NGO in the world. So I think some really interesting stuff for Devex viewers.
Great. Well, I look forward to the conversations, and we'll stay tuned. Thanks.
Good day, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this discussion on carbon markets. My name is Rumbi Chakamba. I'm an associate editor here at Devex, and today I'm joined by Bruno Ugal, senior advisor at Central African Forest Initiative Secretariat, Gilles Defra, a policy officer for carbon pricing at Carbon Market Watch, as well as Yamida Danet, director of climate negotiation at World Resources Initiative. Thank you guys for joining me. So Article 6 is going to be one of the big topics for discussion and negotiations at COP26. And many people are expecting a resolution from this, and we're not sure if that's going to happen. Yamide, what are we expecting in terms of Article 6?
Thank you very much, and hello everyone. What we expect is for this particular set of rules to help countries to deliver and to design more ambitious actions, to deliver them more effectively and at a faster pace. And it's going to be very important for this to happen that the rules are very robust, because if not, they can do the reverse. It can undermine the ambition that we need to see towards 1.5 and be not credible enough to create the trust, that the market needs and also a wider stakeholder needs to see on the ground.
Thank you so much. And Bruno, so there've been quite a few sticking points in terms of Article 6. Can you take us through those? But can you also just break down what Article 6 is?
I will rather put the perspective basically from the European countries and in terms of carbon markets, and for sure the needs in terms of finance are absolutely huge, and public finance is definitely insufficient. So the private sector finance is necessary in that sense. And carbon markets may be a key enablers to do that. But an important thing that is to take into account from the developing countries' perspective is that basically a stable and predictable financial resources is absolutely essential. And basically there are really huge questions regarding a fair and stable carbon price, with the idea that basically a $5 per ton of carbon is definitely insufficient. And developing countries will need the stability and the predictability, which can be an issue in terms of with the market's volatility. So again, in terms of transformational policies and basically the transformational agenda by the governments, there is really a need to be able to get really substantial funding to support basically that transformation. But again, with quite a predictability and clarity over the long term. So that's definitely a big issue. Another one is the complexity of managing basically the high environmental integrity that is required for the system to work, and basically making sure that there is a clear rule book to avoid all the kind of issues associated with double counting or double financing, and basically the issue of safeguards at multiple scales. So really, that clear rule book from the UNFCCC is absolutely essential to have really to avoid further fragmentation, different rules that developing countries have difficulty to deal with, and really aligning the subnational with the national initiatives, with the national reference frameworks. So that's really a big issue that needs to be settled within these negotiations.
And Giles, this isn't the first time that we're negotiating this. This has been ongoing. Can you take us through the history of these negotiations?
Yeah, exactly. Hello to everyone. I mean, it's been now over 5 years that countries are negotiating the rules for Article 6, so establishing or regulating new carbon markets. And of course, this is part of a broader history whereby carbon markets have been existing under the UN system, under the Kyoto Protocol for over a decade now already. So there is a significant amount of experience that countries and also private sector actors have accumulated in how to engage in carbon markets. But unfortunately, the experience so far has been quite negative. I think we have to draw the line on the markets from the past, on the clean development mechanism, which clearly has not delivered on the promises and has not really contributed to any significant emission reductions. What's also very clear is that it has been very unequal in its geographic distribution as well. And we see, for example, that very, very few projects have been developed in the African continent. And so what we really hope and needs to achieve is to break from the past and mark a clear break between the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement when it comes to carbon markets. And so this means not only not carrying over and not continuing with the old credits and the old projects that come from the previous system, so not meeting new targets with old credits, but also making sure that we learn from the mistakes that we have made under the Kyoto Protocol, and that we do establish a robust system, as was mentioned by the previous speaker, that there is no double counting, that we review rules around environmental integrity, social impacts. So we do have a basis to learn from, and this is what we should be doing to establish the new system.
So one of the things that you've mentioned, Gilles, is like the unequal access. Yamida, what can an agreement mean for developing countries now?
Yes, this is an important question. I think there's two things. Again, let's remind ourselves why we are even here, at this COP. It's about keeping 1.5 alive, so really ratcheting up and accelerating our path on mitigation side, but also with solidarity and making sure that countries are resilient to even a 1.5 degree world. So a good outcome on this market mechanism, could be first that those vulnerable countries, is that those participating are really playing the game right. There's a level playing field. Nobody is given a free ride, and it contributes. It's not just an offsetting trading mechanism, but it really results in additional action. It's about better, more, faster action. And as Gilles said, history shows that we cannot, it's easy not to get that. So this is why, the rules needs to be so robust. The other dimension for vulnerable countries is that solidarity and resilience aspect, because they are demanding for, that the revenue generated in using this market mechanism to go to the adaptation fund to help them to be more resilient to the market mechanism. And then what vulnerable countries and communities are also asking is to make sure that, based on the lessons from the past, as alluded to, that it does not undermine human rights. It doesn't have an adverse effect on indigenous people. So these are three elements. And for that, credibility, transparency, and accountability is going to be really important. And this is linked to also the process of transparency, to make sure that there's a way to not only look at how countries are reporting, to understand clearly what is going on. And you've seen that you heard a lot of announcements made, but there were a lot of discussion as to what does it mean? Is it real? And this is why transparency and accountability in those matters. And yes, so I think, linking the transparency agenda, and the use of market mechanism is very important.
Thanks so much, Yamida. You mentioned three things there that are really important: credibility, accountability, and transparency. Bruno, are we seeing these things within the Article 6 negotiations? And what support can we give to vulnerable countries and developing countries to actually make sure that they're able to make use of this?
I think you're touching at an absolutely essential point. I mean, we have to recognize that this is complex, and actually that developing countries have very different capabilities and readiness status for that. And so it's absolutely essential that carbon markets are not trying to replace the need for public finance, because that public finance will be a catalyzer to actually help the countries being ready for this, to deal with this complexity, to deal with all the reporting requirements from implementing carbon market initiatives at different scales, from the national level to actually the subnational local level. It's really, really complex and difficult. And working with countries from Central Africa, we can see definitely a very different status in terms of readiness with, for example, some Latin American countries. It will be really absolutely essential from the international community to support these countries to be ready and as Gilles was mentioning, being able basically to capitalize on these new opportunities. And so it's really about how to make sure that we can balance that the very high integrity, that is environmental integrity, that is absolutely essential for the climate, with the very varying capacity from the countries, with the idea of not leaving countries behind, basically.
Yeah. Gilles, one of the things that you mentioned earlier, not in this conversation, was that it's not worth having a deal at any cost. Do you still believe this is the case? Because this is as much like a political negotiation as it is. Do you still believe that this is the case? And what are we willing not to sacrifice in order to have a deal on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a very important point. And first, it's important to understand that the Article 6 negotiations that are taking place here at this COP are not about establishing a new market, but rather about regulating trades which are already authorized under the Paris Agreement. And so in that sense, it is important to have an agreement because we do want to regulate those trades. But having said that, we don't think that carbon markets or the trade of international emission reductions is really kind of a sine qua non condition to meeting the Paris Agreement objectives. And having a market that is badly regulated, that maintains loopholes, that, for example, allows double counting, that allows the use of old credits to meet new targets, this, in a sense, gives cover and legitimacy to countries who would want to exploit those loopholes. Having an agreement and having sort of, let's say, UN label on the system that allows these countries to exploit the system really creates a problem that it makes it harder to explain, I think, to the general public, to civil society, to media, even to policymakers, why it is not acceptable to use this system. And that's why having no deal is better than having a bad deal, because we don't want to have a market that has the legitimacy of a UN agreement while really leaving the door open for lots of abuses. And so one of the things that really cannot be agreed to, or that really should not be part of any final Article 6 deal, is the allowance of double counting, because this is not a negotiation about ambition. It's not a negotiation on what exactly we're going to do. It is really a discussion of, are you allowed to cheat or not? And if we set up a system where countries or entities are allowed to cheat, it just doesn't make sense. As soon as we start counting emission reductions multiple times, then the whole kind of Paris Agreement and NDC framework falls apart, because you have targets that are met on paper, but with no real reductions that matter to the atmosphere. And so this would really be a system that doesn't work, and we'd rather have no deal than a system that allows for that, even for a short period of time.
I love that you mentioned that word cheating, because double counting is essentially just cheating. So Yamide, can you please explain this concept of double counting and how it can be manipulated and what the risks are to the current climate goals? And are you also of the same agreement that it's better to have no deal than a bad deal?
Let me really confirm that I totally agree with Jill. There's a lot of risk in not getting it right, and it's better, not to have any rules, but to set, standards that would actually undermine all the efforts and be contrary to the goals of the Paris Agreement. We acknowledge that if we do not have the right rules, if we don't agree anything, there's going to be a risk, because there is a voluntary market that is already put in place. But this is very important to get right in any case. The second, to your second question, let's imagine that you do have two countries cooperating. One country A is buying a credit from a country B that has more potential to reduce emission. You don't want, when we look at those two countries, to see that both of them claim that emission reductions, one would be cheating, one will have a free ride, compared to the other. And when we would do, and if you imagine that several countries are doing the same, what we're going to assess collectively will not be representative to what the atmosphere sees. So this is just to illustrate, the stake of having corresponding adjustment, basically adding or subtracting, whether you're a seller or a buyer, to make sure there's no double counting, there's no double claiming.
And I'm imagining that the accounting of all this is going to be so essential. How difficult is it, Bruno, to account for these credits?
We cannot really emphasize enough the complexity of that, actually, and especially working for myself on the forest and land use sector, it is extremely complex, and we see that already with the voluntary carbon market that works especially at the local level, and where basically the methodology that are being used to actually define the baselines and account for the emissions reductions. The methodologies are vastly different from those used at the national level under the UNFCCC. So the big risk is to end up comparing basically pear with oranges and really having something that is not adequate. So it's really about being able to work across scales, so really from the local to let's say the subnational, provincial level, etc., up to the national level, acknowledging that depending on the schemes and initiatives we're talking about, there are different standards, different methodologies, and that basically that's really complex to actually manage and really requires to work with registries at the national levels and a regulatory framework that is in place. And again, that requires a lot of capacity building, and not all countries are at the same level. So again, that will really requires substantial funding to actually support the countries in being able to set up that kind of framework. And sets again the question as well of, for example, countries like least developed countries, LDCs, and basically all the question of corresponding adjustments in the context of LDC that have taken quite very ambitious commitments, emission reduction commitments, without necessarily all the time the understanding of the real opportunity cost behind, and questioning their ability to actually meet their own commitments before actually supporting others as well.
I'm so glad you mentioned capacity buildings. Jill, would you say that efforts are being made to build this capacity for less developed countries? Is that already happening, or is that something that we need to see happening?
I would say this will be a start in that. There are some efforts ongoing, and there have been useful exchanges between developed and developing countries on trying to reinforce the capacity. But it is also definitely a major request from developing countries, and I think a very fair one, to have a dedicated program to have capacity building to ensure that the developing countries can actually engage in those markets. Otherwise, there is indeed the risk that mostly those countries which have the ability and the capacity to navigate these complex accounting systems will be the ones who can engage in trading, and who are typically also larger countries or the more developed or those that are growing faster and have a bit more capacity. So that's definitely a very important component of the discussions. And I think it's probably one of the elements where there's a bit more agreement within the discussions, of saying, yes, we do need capacity building. It's in the interest of everyone that all countries can engage in this. So hopefully that can be agreed in the end. And then I just wanted to comment also on the previous point of accounting. I mean, I fully agree with the comment that accounting is very, very technical. It is not easy to ensure the avoidance of double counting. However, we also need to keep in mind that the discussion today is very much happening also at political level, where some countries are not even trying. So it is complex, and we do need to have very specific systems in place to avoid double counting. But in order to have those systems in place, we need countries to cooperate. And today we have some countries that are saying, actually, there is no problem with double counting. We are allowed to count the reduction which we have already solved. And so we should not fall into the trap of saying, well, actually, it's very complex, and so let's take the time to figure out how it works, etc. We first absolutely need a political signal and agreement that says we do not want to allow double counting, and we will account for that. And we can have a work program or further exchanges on how to really operationalize it from the technical point of view. But what we're missing right now is the political agreement to avoid double counting. And that is just, frankly, quite ridiculous on the part of those countries that oppose it.
Yamida, so Jill spoke about countries manipulating the systems and sort of like consciously manipulating the system. Is there, if an agreement is made, is there any repercussions for that? Or?
So I think this is a very good point, and let me come back on the issue of capacity building. Actually, it is linked to what what has been said previously. One area that needs to be really enhanced, because we had the experience of carbon markets with just developed countries, and I think the challenge, and we know already that there's been challenges, and that if not done right, it can undermine the system. We already know that. So imagine when we expand from 40 countries to 200, and that many of those countries do not necessarily have, the structure, to all the registries and all the data and the accuracy of the data to make sure that we can do this. So capacity building is really important to get the transparency framework, the data and ambition loop right, to really get there. Now, what we hear already during this COP, some countries making announcement and we just don't understand whether it's true ambition or not. We heard some, right? Whether they are using a different baseline than the previous one. So, there's different ways to get away. And this is what we need to really address with those negotiations. So whether, and that's even beyond, the accounting of credit. So let alone with this. And I think the market overall would like to see good standards to respond and to really push forward the innovation that would be needed. And yes, at the moment there's not a lot of consensus, as Jill said, because some countries are very much entrenched in their own interests, and some corporate interests are also making it more complicated as well. So I think we cannot be naive, but we just need to push for what we also know needs to be done to really get to where we need to be.
Thank you so much for bringing that up. Bruno, could you please explain what how corporate interests are playing a role in this negotiation?
For sure, the whole point behind the carbon markets is to make sure that basically there is support for more emission reductions at a lesser cost, and for sure for a lot of those corporate interests. The point is really to make sure that they're able to actually achieve the emission reduction that are required for them at the lesser cost. And again, not necessarily with the same understanding on how the rules work and the same capacity behind. So again, it's really, really important to make sure that there is a fair field level where basically all the different parties are supported to make sure that they can understand their own interests, what's feasible and not feasible, and not let the other ones get away with the better deal. So that's really essential in those complex discussions.
And as we're speaking and we think of things like accountability and we think of things of capacity building, a question just comes up for me, and Jules, maybe you can answer this one for me. Are we actually ready for an agreement? We are talking about getting an agreement done this year at this COP, but are we actually ready for an agreement?
I think an agreement would really signal the start of a new phase of the work, right? So the work on Article 6 and on establishing a new carbon market does not end with an agreement, whether it's at this COP or in the future. And on that, I mean, I think it's probably a bit of a now or never point today. But even if we do have an agreement today, it basically means the detailed work, the technical work is starting. We will have to develop the capacity of developing countries. We will have to develop methodologies, accounting rules, safeguards. That will be a very important point to develop that has been crucially missing in the past to ensure the avoidance of negative impacts at local level. And so all these things really need to be operationalized going forward after an agreement comes. And so anything that might be agreed here is really the start of more work.
So an agreement is only the starting point, but does it mean that certain countries will be able to make use of this agreement before others? Yamida, I'll pass that on to you.
Well, some countries would be ready before others, to really make the most of such an agreement. And this would be the case for developed countries because they do have the experience of the Kyoto Protocol. Under the Kyoto Protocol, you had, some countries who were not ready. And I think this linked to the question that you asked me earlier about, whether there's going to be some compliance mechanism. We used the transparency framework, the measurement, reporting, and review process in the past, to really flag when a country, didn't have the infrastructure, the institutional framework, and that the data sets were not trustworthy, to put a flag, and that this country may not be in a position, to participate in trade agreements, because that could really distort or undermine, the robustness of, the process. And because of that, some countries got their capacity enhanced, did some, actually double their efforts to get ready to embrace, this market. And I think here under the Paris Agreement, we would have to use the transparency framework, the review mechanism, but also the facilitative compliance, committee. There's less stick, more carrots. Probably it's more facilitative than it was under the Kyoto Protocol. But to really still incentivize and build that capacity, because we're going so much at such a bigger scale of participation. So yes, I just wanted to to insist, and I think Gilles is totally right. That I think we are now going from treaty design, rules design, to maybe more rules, but implementation. And we will see probably also more pilots. And actually, some countries have started to pilot some aspect of those rules, like Switzerland, with Senegal, with Peru, with a few other countries. We may see more piloting so that we also learn more, to make sure that we go into the right direction.
Thank you so much. And unfortunately, we're now coming towards the end of our conversation. But just to summarize, I just want from each of you, are you expecting an agreement this year? And what would you like to see in there? Key elements. I'll give you guys each a minute, each starting with you, Bruno.
I hope there will be, definitely. We see, as Gilles mentioned, basically there is already a lot of things happening on the ground, and we see that actually the pace is accelerating. So it's really time. It's really essential that we have that rule book and that roadmap ready as soon as possible to actually provide the necessary framework to make it work fairly. So yeah, it is necessary.
And Gilles?
Yeah, I think an agreement is, let's say, is definitely more likely than it was maybe a month ago. So there's definitely willingness to get to an agreement. There are many things I would like to see, but just to limit it to three, maybe I would like to make sure old credits in the past are not used to meet new targets, new NDCs. I would like to make sure we have accounting rules that do not allow any sort of double counting, and also that human rights and the rights of indigenous peoples are properly reflected, are promoted and protected within the text and in the later operationalization of Article 6.
Thank you so much. And you, Yamide?
Well, I am also hopeful, but not at all costs. I think that was, said before. So if we're getting something that is weakened, we will need to be ready also to call it out. But I just hope that countries will remain focused to bring coherence with the set of decisions, that it's going to support reaching 1.5, keep resilient, with it, with the solidarity and cooperation that we need, and the credibility and accountability, to make this happen. And more work to do to be done after that. But yes, we need to have those foundations. So this is what I am looking for.
Okay, thank you all for joining me for this fascinating discussion. We'll definitely be on the lookout for that agreement to see if all these things are incorporated within the agreement and to watch out for the work that starts after the agreement. Thank you guys for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to this Devex event at COP26. I'm here with Salim Haq, who's director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development, based out of Dhaka. Mr. Haq is one of the most vocal advocates for climate justice, and this, believe it or not, is his 26th COP, so we're really lucky to have him with us today. Salimo, if I could begin by asking you, as this is your 26th COP, what are some of the biggest changes that you observed in that time? And are you more optimistic now than you were 26 years ago about climate justice and the climate change process?
Well, the biggest change over the last 26 COPs, which has been more than 26 years, is that climate change has arrived already. This COP, the 26th COP, is the first COP of this new era of loss and damage from human-induced climate change. And so the issue is orders of magnitude more important now than it was for the last 25 years. And that's because we failed to do the things we were supposed to do in the last 25 years.
Do you think it's beneficial that this has become such a big, almost Davos-style event?
Well, I wouldn't compare it to Davos at all. Davos is a meeting of rich people in the mountains of Switzerland. This is a meeting of every government on the planet. It's the nearest thing we have to global government. And these governments came together many years ago and signed a treaty called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that governs what happens at these annual COPs. They're meetings of governments to review progress on what they were supposed to do, what they said they would do, whether they're doing enough or they need to do more, of governments. And then the rest of us who are not governments, we are just here as observers and hangers-on. The important part are governments talking to each other to solve global problems which only governments can solve.
Some people have compared this particular COP run by the UK, where there are lots of rich business people coming in and lots of special interests as well, as almost a sort of a two-track kind of process with the announcements and the other meetings on one side and then the actual UNFCCC negotiations going on the other side. Does that sound like a fair characterization to you?
It's a fair characterization of every COP. Every COP is a multiplicity of events. As I just mentioned, the core purpose of the meeting is for 200 governments to come together over 2 weeks, the first week being at a technical level, the second week being at a political level, to review progress of the Framework Convention and now of the Paris Agreement, which we achieved in COP21 back in 2015, and to make progress along those lines amongst the governments. That maybe numbers a few thousand people, government delegates. And then we have many, many more thousands. I hear we have really 30,000 people in Glasgow who are not here for the negotiations. They're here to do many different things. The Greta Thunberg's on the street demonstrating. The business people are in the five-star hotels meeting and wining and dining. The academics and researchers are in the universities in Caledonian and Strathclyde having meetings on the research and the science. And all the venues around Glasgow, in and around Glasgow, are taken up by different groups, indigenous groups, youth groups, women's groups. They're all here to network, to work together, to strategize, to take actions together. So it's a multiplicity of things happening in the same city at the same time, the core business being governments talking to each other.
You've said before that COP isn't fit for purpose. Maybe you could clarify what you meant by that, if it was just the government side, the negotiation side of things, and why you think that is.
Well, what we have had so far is an annual meeting once a year at the end of the year, November, December, called the COP, the Conference of Parties. It's a 2-week-long meeting of governments. Now, as I've said earlier, this year, 2021, we are already seeing climate change. We're no longer planning, anticipating, preparing. We are going to have to deal with it. And that's happening every single day, not once a year, every single day as we speak. And so we need a system of dealing with the problem that is commensurate with the problem. And the vulnerable countries have made that demand here in Glasgow. They were here, the leader of the vulnerable countries, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina of Bangladesh. And they have asked for a Glasgow emergency pact, calling it an emergency, which means once a year is not good enough. Every day we're going to have to do stuff and talk about doing stuff and tackle the problem and monitor who's doing what. Not just come once a year to talk about it anymore. That's the sense in which I said it's no longer fit for purpose. So once a year meeting is no longer good enough.
What sort of things would you like to see?
Every single day, every country, every government, every company, every NGO, every organization that is signing up to do actions. We have these big campaigns on road to zero, race to resilience. Everybody's signing up to something, but are they doing anything? So let's hear them tell us what they're doing every day. We want a report from somebody every day on what they're doing, and then we can collate those and look at those. And then once a year, we can review progress and see who's doing what and who's doing enough, who's not doing enough, and who's greenwashing.
You said before that this common phrase, people who are climate vulnerable, you've said you actually like to refer to these people as first adapters. Could you explain a little bit more to us about that?
Sure. So I've been working for the last more than 2 decades on helping the most vulnerable communities adapt to the impacts of climate change. And I used to refer to them as the most vulnerable frontline communities. But now that we are seeing climate change happen, and climate change is happening, these communities are having to deal with it already now and to adapt to it. So they're no longer preparing to adapt, they are adapting. And as they adapt, they're learning how to adapt. They actually have a lot of knowledge and experience. And we, the outsiders, can learn from them. So I now call them the first adapters, and particularly the local level adapters. And incidentally, they're not just in poor countries, they're happening in rich countries as well, even in the United States, even in Europe, even in the UK. There are local communities who are being affected by the impacts of climate change and who are taking actions and learning what to do. So we are preparing a network of these local adapters. We call it Gobeshona. It's a Bangla word for research, where we try and link up these local adapters from around the world and learn from each other.
Could you give me some examples of what this first adaptation looks like, maybe perhaps from Bangladesh?
Sure. So in Bangladesh right now, we have a very large number of people in the tens of millions living on a very, very low level near the sea in the low-lying coast. And these people are suffering, on the one hand, for drinking water during the dry season. The salinity has come into the water and they have to drink saline water. So if you and I were to visit, you would actually taste salt in the water that they have to drink. A normal human body can absorb that, but some can't, particularly pregnant women. They suffer from hypertension that leads to preeclampsia, and this has been well documented. So now, in thousands and hundreds of thousands, and even in the millions, the people in those areas are putting rainwater harvesting tanks on their rooftops. They capture rainwater during the monsoon, and then they use that for drinking during the dry season, which is a couple of months. And that's just one example of people doing it themselves. Similarly, farmers in that area who grew traditional varieties of rice now those varieties can't survive the salinity in the water. So they use saline tolerant varieties which have been produced by our plant scientists. We have some very good rice research plant breeders, and they've released a number of varieties of salt tolerant varieties of rice which the farmers plant, pay for. They're more expensive than traditional varieties, but they survive, so they can afford to pay for them. And now millions of farmers in millions of hectares are growing salt-tolerant varieties of rice. These are just a couple of examples of many, many different things that are happening in Bangladesh.
Do you think NGOs, particularly in the global north, need to get a bit better at listening to and interacting with these first adapters, particularly in Bangladesh and other places in the global south?
Well, when it comes to adapting to the impacts of climate change, I would say that Bangladesh is probably ahead of any other country, whether it's in the global south or in the global north, because we've been dealing with this for longer. We've been figuring out what to do, and we've been trying and testing many, many different things. So the knowledge we are gaining on, particularly on local level adaptation, is applicable and usable by other countries. First, South-South, other developing countries. We're doing a lot of South-South knowledge exchange. That's what my center does in Bangladesh. But then even south to north, even the rich countries can learn from us. And so this is an area of global knowledge where the rich can actually learn from the poor.
Do you see the COP as kind of essential to building that process?
The COP has a very big role to play in that. In fact, as I mentioned, the COP is not just government negotiators negotiating inside a few rooms. There are many, many different side events going on here within the Blue Zone and even outside the Blue Zone in Glasgow, where different groups are meeting and sharing knowledge and information. There's a very interesting pavilion of the IPCC where the scientists are presenting their work. Every country has a pavilion where they're presenting their work. Bangladesh has a pavilion where they're presenting the work that they're doing. So the knowledge sharing, knowledge exchange function of the COP is a very, very valuable function. But that's not what the negotiators are here for. That's what the rest of us are here for.
So you've mentioned Bangladesh. Can you name any other countries you kind of think of as climate leaders and perhaps maybe organizations as well?
Sure. So in the climate vulnerable arena, the least developed countries as a group and the climate vulnerable forum countries as a group are well organized to share their knowledge and information. In addition to Bangladesh, I would name Bhutan. Bhutan is currently leading the LDC group. They are way ahead of any other country in terms of particularly the forests and emission reductions. They have negative emission reductions. They actually take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere with their trees. And then there are other countries like Kenya and Uganda in Africa, the Gambia in West Africa. There are a whole host of vulnerable countries who have not been sitting idle for the last 10 years. They've been doing stuff, learning stuff on drought resistance, on flood resistance, on cyclone resistance. We are learning, we're sharing with each other. And we can also share and learn from the developed countries as well. You know, knowledge has no boundaries. It can move in all directions.
So we've spoken a little bit about adaptation. One of the big themes of this COP is, of course, loss and damage. And I think this is something particularly close to your heart. Could you outline for us how much, progress you think there has or has not been over the past week? And, is that going to be enough going forwards?
So the issue of loss and damage has already been acknowledged. It was acknowledged in Warsaw in COP19, where we set up the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage. That's done some very good work over the years. Last COP, COP25, when we were in Madrid, we had the occasion to review progress, and the vulnerable countries asked for two things. They wanted a technical wing, a body to support technical assistance and knowledge on loss and damage, because it's a complicated issue. We need to know what to do. But at the same time, they also asked for funding. Now, at the end of the COP, and this issue went till the very end into extra time, we got the first, something called the Santiago Network, was named. It wasn't fleshed out, but it was named that we would have it. But we didn't get the second, nothing on money. The Santiago Network is now being elaborated here over the last few days. Negotiators have been going into the fine print of what it will do, how it will work, where it will be. And day before yesterday, they went up to midnight on the wording. I understand they do have wording. So the Santiago Network looks like a done deal here in Glasgow. That's a good outcome. But it's still a technical outcome. It's about learning, knowledge, research, sharing information, not about doing anything about loss and damage. On the finance, we haven't gotten anywhere yet, but we are still pushing. We've got a few days left. We'll see what happens at the end. One interesting thing that has happened outside the COP is that our host government, which is Scotland, in addition to the United Kingdom, the First Minister of Scotland has actually put £1 million on the table to start a loss and damage fund and challenged other leaders to match it. Now, Scotland isn't a party to the convention, so they're not here negotiating, but they are a host country and they have a budget of their own and they put some money on the table. So we're hoping that might spark some interest in matching it.
What's been really encouraging for you so far at this COP, aside from what you've just mentioned?
What encourages me at this COP and all COPs is meeting lots and lots of very interesting people, some old friends, meeting old friends, making new friends, and the energy that I find with the non-negotiators, the observers, the people that I mix with, that I belong to. The negotiations are extremely tedious, dry, and uninteresting, and in the end, we hope something will come out, but they have a long history of disappointing us.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much for your time, Salim ul Haq, and thank you very much for watching. Do stay with us as we continue to cover COP26 with Devex. Hi everybody, welcome back to Devex at COP26. I'm here with Preeti Sinha, the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Capital Development Fund, and we're going to be talking a little bit about their work and how it relates to climate. Preeti, thank you so much for joining us. Could you explain for us, first of all, for those viewers who might not be so familiar with the UNCDF's work, a little bit about what you do and particularly how it relates to climate finance?
Yeah, thanks, Will, and good morning and afternoon to all. So on behalf of the UN and many partners of ours in the UN, UNDP, UNEP, FAO, I want to bring to you today the UN Capital Development Fund. You know, we were started back in 1966, meant to be a fund for the least of the developing countries. This was done by the member states. Some vision of it being kind of what IDA is today, the IDA, the World Bank. So what they did for us is give us instruments. We have financing instruments within UN Capital Development Fund. So we can do a whole range of instruments, starting from the grants and technical assistance to loans, guarantees, and now we are doing increasingly 4 or 5 blended funds and bonds. So I would say we are a hybrid development agency and a hybrid development finance agency within the United Nations. And what we do quite importantly for us and for the entire UN system is to work with UN agencies to issue those kinds of additional instruments, whether it's in environment, climate, women. And of course, we first keep our countries at the fore. So we work with countries, we work with the UN system.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And can you explain a little bit about how that relates to specifically climate finance, which is obviously huge on the agenda of this COP26?
Yes. Well, for me, you know, country leadership and country ownership of the issue is the most important. So in terms of our work on climate, we interlock very closely with the countries. And in our case, we are mandated to cover the 46 least developed countries. And these we find are exciting frontier markets, lots of development to do. So somewhere build new better. What we do is climate adaptation and climate mitigation. So on adaptation, we have a facility called LOCAL, which stands for Local Climate Adaptive Living Facility. Here we go in and we really help the countries at the local level to do climate adaptation. We give them performance-based grants. So the grants are sort of benchmarked to performances that they'll do in creating adaptations with the youth, with the local communities. And when they do that, we help them get accredited to other vertical funds, you know, like the Green Climate Fund and so on. So we've done that for about 3 countries, get them direct access. So this is important. So some of the keywords, direct access to funds, working with local communities, because a big topic at the COP here, COP26, has been a lot of this money is being announced, but it's not reaching the local levels. So as you'd see from our name, the idea is to be with the local community. So yesterday we were with Gambia, for example, and Gambia has been the top in its NDC announcements and achievements. And they said as well, we would like to see the capital flow down to the local level. So that's on the adaptation. On the mitigation, it's much more on the renewable solar energy projects. So again, giving an example of Gambia again, that we created a guarantee. So it's a financial instrument. It's no longer just a plain grant. And we guaranteed a solar plant for 10 megawatts. And that brought in, we put in 9 million of guarantee, that brought in 15 million of private capital. So that's that de-risking that's being also talked about at COP this year. And then we can come to blended finance, which is a big example as well here.
Sure, if you could tell me about the blended finance you have.
So again, one of the things we've done is we've created a fund called the Build Fund. It's a blended finance. It's one of 3 or 4 I could talk about. And this is in partnership with Bamboo Capital, a very well-known impact fund out of Geneva. And this fund, it's 250 million, 50 million in first loss, put up by governments such as Luxembourg, Norway, the US. And that will invest in SMEs in LDCs being least developed countries. So we went ahead and put in, again, a $500,000 loan. And remember, we work in the last mile. And for these countries at their stage of development, these loans are quite valid, quite responsive, because they help companies get off the ground, because these companies don't have any access to finance otherwise. So this company called Mavezi, and it's a solar distribution company. It makes solar products. So between Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, they're going to distribute solar products. So again, bringing in the mitigation, bringing in renewable energy. So we would love to see these countries, the least of the developed, being on the forefront of climate mitigation adaptation.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
So you deal with loans and you also deal with grants. You'll be aware of the debates between, people want more grant-based climate finance as opposed to loan-based climate finance. Where do you kind of sit in that side of the climate finance debate? Do you think there is place for both?
So again, I would go back to the country. So we've had great dialogues with Papua New Guinea here as well. And I think it's encouraging the countries. Yes, it's giving them a certain amount of grants. We always shape our grants in the form of technical assistance, technical assistance to the government, to do policy, to do infrastructure, to do loans. But then really encouraging them to use those grants to get ready for the financial markets, so to bring in the loans. So we call it an investment continuum. And maybe that's a word that could be used here, that grants are good and they're needed to take off. Sometimes the projects, the companies, but let's move on. And what we do is we give loans from our own balance sheet, which are concessional, and that gets people ready for the commercial loans. So the local banks, the local financial institutions start lending. So an investment continuum, that's the word I'd use.
Coming from a private finance sector background, as you do, and moving into the UN system, particularly working around, issues of sustainable development, what are some of the key things that stand out for you as either good or bad and need to be worked on? Great
question, Will. It's actually, let me take it to the vision. So after being here about 9 or so months, the good and the bad, what I want to do, I want to see more country leadership, the voice of, the developing countries on the table, expressing what they need, right? And I mean, how does the other countries know what they need? Let them express it. So I want that. So for example, Kenya, they've decided they want to plant trees, 2 billion trees. So we were on a panel with Kenya, tree planting. So I want to know the countries well. I want their voices to be strengthened. At the same time, I want to know the institutional capital, the private capital that's willing to engage in dialogue, and then have at the first phase just a dialogue. So let BlackRock, let all the PIMCOs, everybody present here, talk to countries like Liberia, Guinea, Senegal. Let's discuss. Let the familiarity grow. And UNCDF would like to be in that kind of engagement, and we're doing that in New York. We are bringing some of these country leaders to some of the mid-sized big banks to have dialogues. And as that dialogue goes, as the familiarity grows, I think the investment strategies between the two will grow, between the countries, and public capital always stands ready, but private capital coming in. And then what we need to do is create de-risking facilities. So the public capital now needs to do de-risking so that the private will step in much greater volume, in many more multiples. So as you see from our build fund, it's a 20% ratio. So there's 20% first loss by the public money. And that's what you mean by de-risking? Yes. There are two types of de-risking. One is a blended fund, the first loss, that covers the losses of a fund, which we hope will not be that high as well. But then there's a guarantee facility, right? So the guarantee in the Gambian solar plant stands ready to cover the kind of, if the offtake doesn't happen, if the local electric company doesn't take the offtake. So they're kind of two, just de-risking in terms of guarantees and blended financing. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I imagine some of our audience, certainly not all, will be, companies like BlackRock and so on. They'll probably approach that with a bit of wariness. I mean, what might you say that would either placate these kind of anxieties about these very large private sector companies getting involved with issues like sustainable development? Yeah. Is it part of UNCDF's role to make sure that's done in a more equitable way? Absolutely. How do you respond? Well, this idea is coming from BlackRock on the de-risking. So Larry Fink, I think it was in the G7 or the G20, has called upon public capital to provide him the kind of the de-risking, and again those two facts, so that BlackRock money could enter into sustainable development. So I would say you would see that at COP here a lot. That has been one of the main themes of engagement of public and private capital. Mark Carney, with his background in the banks and now his role currently, has brought together this famous 130 trillion, which is basically all the banks and asset owners coming in half and half, saying we have this capital that will engage. But for them to engage, you will have to see the de-risking happen. Okay. And so there's a call on public capital to think more about creating vehicles, using their money to create the first loss, to create the guarantees so that the private capital can come in.
The BlackRock are quite well known as like quite a massive fossil fuel investor as well. Do you worry that, like, with being head of a UN agency associating with them and working with them in this way, that would leave you open to accusations of greenwashing?
I think that is something certainly that would have to be ring-fenced. So let me tell you what we have done in this COP. We've announced, or we've launched, a climate ETF, exchange traded fund, which is focused on decarbonizing companies. It's a net zero pledge companies that are in that index. So yes, so BlackRock is not in that index. So we are certainly working first with the first movers that have taken the pledge, that are, and this ETF, for example, will not have any stocks that have any fossil fuel in them. So that's our first priority. I would just say, in terms of the dialogue, though, where the money sits, we need to, engage and educate and hear and understand. And I hope that, entities will be able to slowly even try to ring fence part of the assets, and hopefully toward, as we make all these net zero emission announcements, that in the future we'll have that zero fossil fuel aspect. But I think, that has to come step by step. And if you take the developing countries' perspectives as well, they also need to go step by step. So I heard, for example, Nigeria say we can move to gas, but don't take us all the way through, because it's just they have 7,000 megawatts of energy installed.
It's their entire economy.
So we're here, of course, and all the goodwill here at the COP26 to help create that shift. But it's a transition. A great word is transition energies.
So as we speak, COP has not finished. There's still a few days to run. What has been the most encouraging things for you over this past few days?
Yeah, I have really enjoyed seeing the announcements again of these public-private capital funds coming together. So the UK has announced, for example, it said a $2 billion guarantee to the African Development Bank. We've got Bezos and his fund around. We have the Children's Investment Fund around, So they've been, you've seen pockets of investments or these kind of collaborative partnerships of financing going on. For us, the big announcement still to come. So our locale facility.
Can you give us any hints as to what it might be?
I think negotiations are on, and they are still sort of going to be announced hopefully this afternoon. Our idea is that we want something like locale, which is very community-based, to enter into the LDC ministerial position. So we hope that will come forward as a financing mechanism that helps countries access more climate funding. So we are hoping to have a line in the declarations coming out.
Okay. And looking on to the year ahead, it's going to be a year of action.
It is.
What do you think is going to be some of the key themes and some of the key challenges that the organization will have to deal with?
The organization.
UNCDF.
Oh my God, for me, it's not a challenge at all. It's a huge growth opportunity. So when we meet in Egypt in COP27, I would want to have this de-risking facility in UNCDF as well. So we do guarantees right now, but we want to raise additional capital on behalf of the UN, or in terms of the UN agencies, to be able to create these vehicles, these blended vehicles. So that's the way we see the multiples of money coming in. And I hope that we will be a player on the guarantee side, on the guarantee field. We're already there, but hope to be bigger and better by then. So those are that's kind of the direct, focus to COP27. Of course, we hope locale will be bigger. We hope lots of renewable projects will be done. We are ramping up, so both the renewable energy investment and the locale investment. And I think Africa will be taking over some of the co-chairing of some of the issues by the time we reach Egypt. So having our focus on the African countries, we hope that they'll be on the table much more and sort of putting their views forward and really helping design the development of their own countries.
Okay, well, it's going to be an interesting year.
It is going to be a fascinating year. And I really hope and thank, the UK government for hosting us this time. They've done an incredible job. And I was there at the Leaders Summit, the World Leaders Summit on the first day. And it was really great energy. My particular hero, David Attenborough, and he always has the right message. He said, no economy is developed yet because nobody is fully sustainable yet. So, it's some sort of a, we all need to be kind of zero circular sort of waste economy. Zero
Was
waste.
it the standout speech for you of the leaders event?
I think so. I think he comes with such a deep perspective, long years of experience, and truly speaks for the planet. So, David Attenborough, my regards to you.
All right.
Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation on the role of technology solutions in fighting the climate crisis as part of our Devex at COP26 series of conversations. I'm Catherine Cheney. I'm a senior reporter at Devex focused on technology and innovation and global development, and I'm really thrilled to be moderating this live panel. So just a bit of context before we dive in. To meet climate targets, countries need to quantify, monitor, and reduce their emissions. And of course, technology will be critical in each step of this process. And because repairing the damage that's already been done by climate change will require more than cutting emissions, there's growing interest in technologies like carbon removal and solar geoengineering. You've seen those topics come up on the COP26 agenda. But in addition to developing new technology, we also need to drive down the cost of existing low carbon technologies in order to deploy these technologies everywhere in the world, including in the low and middle income countries that are most impacted by climate change. So today we'll hear from 3 leaders who are tackling climate technology solutions from a number of angles, and I'll quickly introduce them before we dive into the conversation. You'll see them here. Ifeoma Malo is CEO of Clean Technology Hub Nigeria, which is focused on promoting energy access through research, development, demonstration, and incubation of clean energy technologies. She's also the former country campaign director for Power for All in Nigeria, and she led Nigeria's campaign to promote distributed renewable energy and is one of the country's leading energy access experts. Zach Parisa is the co-founder and CEO of NCX. He's working on a carbon exchange built on reliable data. So the technology breakthrough here, as I understand it, and I'll let him expand on this, is combining satellite imagery with field measurements to determine the size and species of every acre of forest in the US. NCX helps American landowners get paid for the carbon they capture in standing trees. And I'm excited to talk with him about this model, or work like it might be extended to low and middle income countries. And Olamide Ongutoye is tech policy lead for the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. He leads policy work at the Tony Blair Institute on energy and climate tech. And recently, Olamide has been active in discussions about sustainability in Africa, as well as the role of connectivity in combating climate change, something I definitely hope we can get to. So thank you all so much for joining us. Really looking forward to the conversation. So my first question is for you, Ife. I know that Clean Technology Hub Nigeria is committed to supporting the next generation of Africa's clean energy leaders. And I really want to make sure in this conversation, we're focused on not just climate technology solutions in the broader sense, but climate technology solutions emerging from everywhere and extending to everywhere. So your mission is very relevant here. And my question for you is what do you see as the big challenges and opportunities to do just that, your mission, support the next generation of Africa's clean energy leaders?
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you to all of the other panelists and organizers. Very happy to be here. So at Clean Tech Hub, we're one of the leading innovation and acceleration centers in West Africa. One of the things that we're seeing with our portfolio of companies is that we're able to get them to do demos of their technologies, their clean technologies, but it's difficult to get them to scale. Part of that challenge is not just the financing part, but it's also the raw materials that they're using to fabricate these technologies in-house. And to get them to scale, they actually need to bring in raw materials through supply chain mechanisms from outside of the country. Now, that's where issues then come in for them, because they're now dealing with issues around, supply chain management, procurement, international procurement, customs. But these are very small companies. So what we need to do is to get people who can actually look at their technologies and then help invest in them locally and help them to think about how to get them to market, to scale. because a lot of the technologies that are developed in Nigeria, at least the ones that we've seen, actually with a bit more push can actually begin to produce at scale. We see that being done in locally fabricated clean cook stoves, which are then sometimes cheaper and easier to maintain than what we would ordinarily get if they were imported. So the three things that I would say are the challenge are a belief in the entrepreneur's demo, looking at sourcing local materials to help them to scale, and local materials that can help them actually make the technologies that they have brought out a bit more steadier and stronger, and also beginning to put in a lot of local financing so that they are not stuck in trying to raise external financing at such a small stage, because they're still very young companies, to be able to help them be distributed locally in the local markets. So those are the three things I would say that we have to begin to really think about, to look at local technologies scaling locally in the communities that they're produced.
Thank you, Ife. And I know you're working to tackle those challenges, but also there's, I assume, an opportunity for the global development community to do even more. I know there's been a big focus on local financing for climate tech entrepreneurs, but it sounds like it's not really moving the needle yet to the extent it needs to, where you're working. So thank you for that preview of your work. I want to bring Zach into this conversation. So Zach, I know you're joining us from Glasgow. So sure. Thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're very busy. I'm seeing your name pop up all over the COP26 agenda, especially events focused on exactly this, climate technology solutions. So I mentioned earlier a little bit about how NCX works, but I wonder if you can kind of expand on the technology itself and how it helps landowners quantify the full value of their forests. And I want to add that I know you're focused on the US, but part of why I wanted to include you in this conversation is I wonder if you can talk about how your model or a similar approach might work globally, including in low and middle income countries.
Yeah, absolutely. And Catherine, thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me. Great to be with all the panelists here. So so just like you said, we use satellite imagery and ground measurements to measure every acre or every hectare of forest every year down to the number of trees by size and species. And that's really important because in order to create markets that can pay landowners to create more forests, to create more carbon dense forests, and to that's respectful of things like biodiversity, water and fire risk, we need robust measurements. These markets are fundamentally different than what we've seen before with extractive markets like timber. With those markets, there's a scale at the mill and there's a physical good that rolls off the property and that people take delivery of. With these, with carbon, with biodiversity, these benefits are happening out in the woods. And so to earn trust, to have trust with these communities, with these landowners, that they're getting paid fairly for the work that they're doing to create these benefits that we all need, and to make sure that the communities, countries, and companies that are paying for these positive outcomes have transparency in what is actually being done on the ground. We need robust measurements, and so really the measurements make the market, and that's been our approach. You ask about expanding to other countries. That's what's different today than where I think we were, even a decade ago, 5 years ago, is that we do have the tools with, for monitoring. We have a lot more satellite sensors up. We have a lot more computational ability, and while there's that part, we also have much more sort of community engagement and I think political will to really expand this further. So our intent is to expand market access, truly democratize access to these markets globally, to the people and places that are at greatest risk.
Absolutely. Well, I'm excited to follow your journey as you look at the global potential for your model. I actually learned about your work in a conversation on climate tech solutions where Mark Benioff from Salesforce mentioned NCX as an exciting company to watch in this space. So that put you on my radar, and really looking forward to following what you do next. A question for Olamide, and part of why I'm so excited to have your perspective is I think you can kind of give us what you see as the landscape of technological solutions here. So I wonder, we've heard from Ife about her work with energy access entrepreneurs in Nigeria. We've heard from Zach about his work on a really exciting technology solution here in the US and potential for global expansion there. So what do you see as some of the most exciting technological solutions for climate change across all the areas I mentioned earlier? What's exciting? What's potentially game-changing? And critically, what role do policymakers have to play in order to ensure that these tech solutions realize their potential?
All right, thanks very much, Catherine. And it's great to be here. Nice to see Zach and Ify. In terms of what's exciting, there is a lot to be excited about. Climate tech is in that phase where virtually everybody and anyone has an opinion about it. And an event like COP26 is even driving up for their media engagement. So there's a lot of exciting things out there. It can be a bit challenging though, because then it also creates a bit of distraction, and which then gives policymakers an issue cutting through the noise and figuring out what's really the thing to focus on. But everything from the technologies we use to replace the old incandescent bulb to the technologies we use to heat up our homes to direct air capture and things like that. There's a whole range of developments happening across the climate tech landscape. And many of them are quite exciting. The ones that I'm particularly interested in, and I just generally find exciting, are those ones that are clearly on a learning curve. And what that means is simply technologies whose price gets to decrease with increasing installation. And we've seen that with quite a number of technologies like solar, for example. In 2009, just about 10 years ago, the price of solar was that. Just 10 years later, it's this. It's gone down by about 90%. If you look at onshore wind, for example, the price has gone down about 75% in just 10 years. And the same kind of learning curve evolution is happening across board in areas like batteries and in some other interesting areas of climate tech. So for me, that's quite exciting. Even though there's so much noise out there, and you have to be able to kind of distinguish between what's the noise and what's really happening, what's the real change. I think there's a lot of opportunity for optimism here. And one of the things we've done, and I've led some of the projects so far at the Tony Blair Institute, is to look at the landscape and to kind of categorize these technologies into three big buckets. So the ones that are already here and now and are already mature, the ones that are a bit on the other extreme end, which needs a bit more R&D support, and everything in between, which needs to be scaled up and ramped up in terms of deployment. So those are the technologies that are out there, and I'm quite excited about them. In terms of what policymakers can do, also along the lines of those three buckets, we have things around standardizing some sorts of technologies. So, for example, the energy efficiency technologies for our homes, and on the other extreme end, where you have R&D support, it's important for policymakers to start kind of looking at what are the bottlenecks, for example, around experimentation and demonstration, which can be supported with public finance. And then everything in between, which requires a bit of public-private partnerships and supporting entrepreneurs and startups to make sure that these technology solutions can be deployed at scale to the market.
Thank you. I love that framing of the three buckets. And I want to remain on that point for a moment, because I think it's a good way to have a conversation, the four of us. But I also see some questions coming up in the Zoom, which we really welcome. That's the benefit of a live panel here. So please keep those questions coming, and I'll try to get to as many as I can. But keeping on this point from Olamide, so these three buckets: technologies that are available and mature, but need to standardize; emerging tech that needs R&D support; and then everything in between, tech that needs to be ramped up by engaging with innovators and entrepreneurs, which I would say is particularly challenging often in low middle income country contexts. So I wonder, it looks like we may have lost Ify. Hopefully she will be coming back shortly. But Zach, a question for you here. Where do you see yourself fitting in these three buckets? And do you think that that's a helpful framework? Do you look at the ecosystem of climate tech solutions similarly, or would you maybe reframe?
No, I think Olamide's framing is actually great. Forests and other nature-based solutions are one of the first best options that we have for sort of emission reduction. And so it was really great seeing commitments to reduce, and eliminate deforestation and carbon removal. And they're sort of the here and now. There have been technical hurdles that have been largely worked through, and there is still need for standardization and clarification of quality in that work. So there's more to do there, but it's really going to take everything to bend the arc on climate change. And so it's really encouraging seeing a lot of the work coming out of so many places, especially beyond Silicon Valley, in the places, as if he was mentioning, where capacity building is so vitally important. And as you know, as we work with forests, and nature-based solutions, they're not an infinite sponge, and so we need that cost curve to be coming down on those technologies that Olamide was talking about that are further out, and really by working both fronts and really investing ourselves and working kind of collectively as a community to drive these things forward. That's how we're going to get to real solutions. Not picking one and saying this is the answer or that is. It's really a yes and situation. But to the point, the important thing here is that forests are one of they are and nature-based solutions overall. I should be more inclusive there, but they're what we can immediately work with today as we make the investments necessary in communities and technology to be there further out with the tech we need to fully remove carbon from the atmosphere and decarbonize our economy overall.
Thanks, Zach. I'm going to ask you a question that came in from the audience, and I'll just relay it directly. The question is remote sensing and satellite technology used to verify landowner reports?
It is, yeah. So satellite imagery and computational technology that allows us to assess that and derive meaningful and actionable information from that data is what enables us, broadly to drive down transaction costs and to ensure trust through that transaction, whether you're working in the United States, Brazil, Indonesia, Guatemala, wherever it is. And the exciting thing is that that's globally available. Those data are globally available. We also use ground measurements to make sure that those assessments are well calibrated. And there's the opportunity, with that for further community engagement. And so that's, yeah.
Thanks, Zach. Really helpful. So I want to talk about climate tech solutions and how they fared in the COP26 agenda specifically. So I guess I'll start with Zach here. Zach, I know you've, again, you're there in Glasgow. You've been involved in a number of conversations on climate tech. So thank you for making time for this one. But how would you say climate technology fared in the COP26 agenda? And can you kind of take us inside some of the conversations you've been having on this topic?
I think there's been a lot of excitement and sort of engagement around the investments in technology. Seeing the private sector really step up and commit large sums to developing these technologies, not just with nature-based solutions, although again, there was a lot of emphasis on that, not only carbon and nature-based solutions, but the communities and biodiversity related to those, and that was really great. But to Olamide's point earlier, that that the full suite of technology is going to require investment, and at least we're seeing commitments that look like that's going to be made, and it's going to be made globally, and that that's like when you started out, it truly is going to take all of us and every yeah. So I'd be interested in hearing from Olamide on sort of his thoughts on how the commitments shaped up and if they meet his.
Yeah, exactly. And quickly, I'll say, Olamide, I'd be interested in both your reflections on how climate tech has fared at COP26, and if you were to somehow pull out a magic wand and turn COP26 into a win for climate tech, what would that look like?
All right. Oh, I need a wand now. Okay. I think so far I would say it's been a mixed bag, but perhaps a bit slightly more on the positive side of things. So it's been good to see some of this private sector commitments and also some public-private partnership types of commitments. So, for example, the Glasgow Breakthroughs, which has been led by the British government and has the collaboration with quite a number of big countries, including China, the US, and Australia, where they're looking at developing certain suites of green technologies, including green electricity, and I think it also includes a bit of green or sustainable aviation fuel, and quite a number of interesting technologies. So that's very encouraging to see. Of course, on the other hand, you have people like Jeff Bezos throwing in $2 billion into nature conservation, which is also quite encouraging, and et cetera, et cetera. You have quite a number of such commitments. Some of them have massive supports covering multiple countries. Some of them are kind of led by just a few group of countries or individuals. But on the other end, you also see a lot of the routine finger pointing between countries, countries calling out each other and saying, you're not doing enough, So those things have a way of distracting from the real agenda. We're at a time where, every second draws us closer to 2050 targets, to 2035 targets, to 2030 targets. The last thing you want to do is to waste another year of COP. Matter of fact, there was no COP last year. It was deferred to this year. So we lost two full years. So that's the last thing you want to do. You want urgent action, and anything else that will distract from, putting our money into climate tech should be limited and avoided. But unfortunately, we've seen a bit of that. But overall, I would say, it's been a bit more on the positive side of things.
Thank you, Olamide. And Ife, good to see you again. I know you were bumped off. Sorry about that. Just to try and bring you into this question, and not intending to put you on the spot, but I was just asking Zach and Olamide, basically, how has climate technology specifically fared on the COP26 agenda? And I wonder, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that while you're based in Nigeria, you're actually in East Africa right now for some meetings that are related to the ongoing conversations in Glasgow, which I thought was really interesting. So I wonder, Zach kind of pulled back the curtain on some of his conversations in Glasgow. Can you take us into what are some of the conversations in East Africa right now? What are the conversations among people like yourself who are supporting this climate tech entrepreneurial ecosystem? Do you think that climate tech is on the agenda in the way it should be at COP26, or how would you reframe the conversation?
That's actually a very good question. So I'm in Kenya as part of the Mini Grid Developers Association, the African Mini Grid Developers Association. And this is a group of developers that are driving mini and microgrids for rural and peri-urban communities. One of the big conversations that we're having here is around data and the lack of it, actually. And to the extent that there is even any data, the lack of synchronization in the data, the lack of certainty in the data. And yet, I mean, this is a problem in sub-Saharan Africa that is a barrier for mini-grid scaling. And yet there are tools to address that. There's obviously a lot of technology tools to address issues around data. There are quite a few companies, about 3 or 4 big known ones on the continent that are trying to address issues around data using IoT, Internet of Things, and artificial intelligence to do that. Now, when it comes to COP, I think there's an assumption that we see from those of us in the global south that there is, when it comes to the technology, that it's almost like a settled topic. Because it's easily available in the West. And so the way that the conversations are framed is, well, how are we going to scale it? What can we do with the data that is already available? And how do we help the companies that are harnessing this data to use it more effectively? It's a different conversation here. The conversation we're having here is there isn't enough data. We're not being able to extract the data using a lot of the remote monitoring systems that are easily available, like I said, elsewhere. And when we do that, there's a lot of issues around how we can deploy it. Also because there's a lot of mistrust between national governments from this side and the technology providers who are mostly foreign investors. And so the question then is, governments are then suspicious also about how this data is going to be utilized. So from a policy level, there's that conversation and tension happening between government and technology providers. And from a technical level, there is also that assumption that, because issues around hardware and software when it comes to technology are almost settled issues in the West, that they're the same here in sub-Saharan Africa. And that's not the case. So a lot of the developers here are still struggling to understand, even when they want to do site selections, how they go about that. Do they have to travel and use remote, take the risks of going into remote villages that they don't really know very well to go collect that data? But we do know that there are other ways of doing that. And so that's that disconnect that's happening. And we see it very evidently at COP, where there's this conversation up here, and then we're having these other conversations down here. So at some point, we have to begin to talk to each other.
Totally agreed. Thank you. No, that's why I'm so grateful for this virtual platform so that we can all come together from Glasgow and from Kenya, and really appreciate your perspective there. We just have a few minutes remaining, but I did want to go back to Olamide on something because I sort of previewed this earlier, and I think it builds on what Ife was just mentioning. in terms of connectivity being a challenge as well. So Olamide, I know you've focused on connectivity and energy access, and I wonder if you can help us better understand why that's such a barrier when it comes to scaling up clean technology solutions really globally.
Right, absolutely. Thanks very much. So yeah, in terms of connectivity, the main thing is the fact that it's a very key enabler, as Ify rightly mentioned. It's how you get your men in the field. It's how you get the mini grids up and running in a remote parts of southwestern Malawi, somewhere in the backside of the mountain. It's how you do your maintenance checks. It's how you get some of these clean technologies deployed at scale and up and running at the most efficient level. So it's extremely important. And what we have at the moment in Africa and in some other parts of the world is an internet penetration level that is still not where it should be yet. It's a mobile penetration level that is still not at the level where it should be yet. And that's why it's a big barrier to the scale up of some of these technologies. The gaps are gradually being closed. We can see some of the numbers around connectivity being increased. If you look at different generations of connectivity technologies, so for example, the old school GPRS, 2G type of connection, the number of years it took to get to a certain population, like a 1 billion population, is far longer than how long it took 3G to get to 1 billion, which is far longer than how long it took 4G. And there are predictions that 5G is going to happen even much faster. And that's because each new generation can leverage the existing connectivity infrastructure to get to more people. So with a bit of optimism, we can hope that connectivity issues will be getting more and more better addressed, and the gaps will be closed. But it still plays a very fundamental role to the scaling up and the enablement of clean technology deployment in Africa.
Absolutely. And when you mentioned the public-private partnerships that will be needed earlier, especially in that middle ground of those three buckets, the sort of everything in between, public-private partnerships to advance connectivity will be critical. So seeing a lot of activity in this space, but there needs to be more. So with just a few minutes left here, I want to go back to each of you, and in about a minute, if you can you expand on, we mentioned at the outset, we need to incentivize breakthrough climate technologies, but we also need to democratize those innovations that already exist. So my question for each of you, if you have a call to action coming out of COP26, what's one thing you want to leave our audience with when it comes to either of those things? How to incentivize breakthrough climate technologies, or how to democratize those innovations that already exist? And if time allows, you can tackle both if you'd like. I'll start with Zach, if that's all right.
Sure. Yeah. So really excellent points from Ify and Olamide there. Like, in terms not just that these tech, some of the tech isn't fully available to all communities, and there's a lot that needs to be done to close that gap. But also that those technology solutions often aren't just drop-in solutions, that we really need to take social context into account if we're going to bring these opportunities to every community and truly be able to scale the solutions as quickly as we need to, and to the point that we need to. And so, yeah, when it comes to a call to action, what can folks do? Get involved in capacity building in whatever community you are in. And work to empower those that are, working in adjacent communities or communities that are connected to the supply chains that you are involved in. If you have the opportunity to invest in these technologies, recognizing that many of them are nascent and have a lot of development to go, do that. But overall, just get involved in the conversation, find opportunities to either be fully engaged in the innovation yourself or support those that are.
Great. Thank you, Zach. Ify, would love to hear your perspective on this. What's your call to action?
I completely agree with Zach. I think mentoring and educating the growing technology entrepreneurs here, especially the renewable energy entrepreneurs, are very important. But even more important is to look at what has happened in Nigeria in the banking sector. A lot of the back-end support for our banking sector has been done by local developers in Nigeria. We need to begin to look at how this local tech can meet local renewable energy needs, just so that we're not waiting for when there's going to be technology that comes from outside the country to come support the ecosystem here. So, and that grew organically because there was a lot of focus in building the capacity, the human capital that could help drive the banking sector. We have banks in rural areas, in some of the most rural areas across Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. How can we do that for the renewable energy sector? That's the big question.
Thank you, Ife. Olamide, we'll give you the last word.
All right. I completely agree with Zach and Ife. I think for me, on top of all that, it's also to get a bit more aggressive with the conversations at an event like COP26. And I think it's high time to have a sort of Paris agreement for climate innovation. We need that level of ambition. COP in the past years have delivered some level of milestones in the past. So in 2009, we had the COP in Copenhagen that delivered the $100 billion climate finance agreement. In 2015, you had the Paris Agreement that delivered the 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees commitment. I think it's high time to have another sort of massive global aggressive agreement around climate tech and innovation. And I think that's the call to action.
Thank you. If we had more time, my follow-up question for all of you would be, okay, what would this Paris Agreement for climate tech innovation look like? But we'll have to hold that conversation for another time. I want to thank you all so much for taking the time to share your insights on this topic. Thanks for the work you're doing in this space, and hope to see a lot more progress on all the work you're doing in climate tech innovation more broadly in the next year. We really need it. So thank you all so much again.
Yeah, thank you all.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi everybody, welcome back to Devex at COP26. I'm Will Worley, I'm the UK correspondent, and I'm here with Asif Saleh, the Chief Executive of BRAC, the largest NGO in the world. And we're going to talk a little bit about BRAC's work and how it interacts with climate today. So as I understand it, Asif, BRAC's work has been influenced by climate change for a long time. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, first of all, BRAC is an organization that works on social challenges, right? So it started about 50 years ago. Now it has expanded across the world in Asia and Africa in particular. But our main operation is in Bangladesh, which is one of the most vulnerable countries in terms of climate change. And our focus in the past has always been around livelihood and adaptation. So particularly because we worked around poverty and livelihood challenges, the most vulnerable population in the coastal areas, they require new kinds of livelihood opportunities. And what we are seeing over the last few years as well, that there has been a steady stream of people who have been migrating to the cities, and they're going into the slums, and particularly in Dhaka. So we have also a large-scale program in the urban slums to help improve their well-being and also reskilling them and look at other livelihood opportunities for them over there. So there's many streams, and a lot of, as you also know, that particularly we have seen in the recent past, the number of disasters in Bangladesh has gone up quite significantly. Just last year alone, while we were dealing with the pandemic on one hand, we had the longest lasting flood in Bangladesh's history. We had a super cyclone, along with all the dealing with the lockdown that was happening. So even though BRAC has been a long-term development organization working on women's empowerment and financial inclusion, education, other things, but what we are finding now is that we are working like a humanitarian organization, moving from one disaster to another. So how do we also cope with disaster? How do we cope with kind of build-in coping mechanism within our programs for people to kind of cope with disasters and shocks? That has become our sort of main sort of priority going forward now.
So you've almost merged from being just a purely development organization into one that is by default had to adapt and become a humanitarian focused organization too.
Absolutely, because that's what we are seeing is that with just one shock, one disaster, years of development work that has gone in, people are kind of falling through the poverty line and going back to starting from zero again. So some level of support that needs to happen very much. So we are adopting as well as things are changing.
Well, could you just give an example of what that looks like in practical terms? How are those people being driven into poverty from just one disaster? And, I understand there's kind of cascading effects. Maybe you could just explain that a little bit for our
I'll
viewers.
just give you one example. I was right before coming here, I was in the northern part of Bangladesh. So this is like October, that was like middle of October. Our monsoon pretty much finishes typically around middle of September. You may sometimes get some rain here and there end of September. But in the middle of October, so right after monsoon finishes, you start sort of, the farmers actually start putting in seeds and stuff for the new cycle of cultivation, right? That's what happened this year as well. And in the north, so when in the middle of October, suddenly huge amount of rain, flash flood, completely unusual, and it wiped away entire sort of set of crops for thousands of families. So flash floods, unheard of. And so they are basically all their savings, they're like, again, basically going back to starting from scratch. They're becoming ultra poor. And in countries like Bangladesh, what happens is there is no lot of social protection here. Barely, so it's very fragmented what support that people get. When this kinds of crisis happens, they don't get a lot of support from the government. So we need to come in and we need to support them as well in terms of some level of humanitarian support so that they can cope. So what does that mean? That means, supporting them with their livelihoods, supporting them with livestock, again, with seeds, new seeds, some level of seasonal loans, that so that they can restart again, right? But these are band-aid solutions. I mean, again, we need to like step back and look at like, how do we really look at the long-term impacts of climate change like this and support farmers, support people who are doing different kinds of activities in those areas for new kinds of activities which can help them to kind of adopt. And that, I feel like, is very much not on the agenda in COP26 right now. It's there, but the reality is climate change's effect is happening now, affecting millions of people as we speak. But when we kind of equate the effects of climate change in countries like Bangladesh to countries like Canada or US, I think we do a sort of injustice for the people, because as I was saying the other day, that we are all in this together, but our boats are very different. And in countries like Bangladesh and in these smaller island countries, our boats are actually sinking pretty rapidly, right? So that attention and urgency needs to be there. So how do we support adaptation very quickly?
And adaptation is sometimes seen as distinct from loss and damage, and sometimes loss and damage is seen as a separate issue depending on where you're coming from. I mean, do you have a position on loss and damage and how you'd like to see it progress through these negotiations?
I think both needs to progress at the same time. Loss and damage is obviously coming from a very much a justice point of the climate justice perspective, which is very important. But again, looking at the people who are at the forefront, they need the tools and supports for them. So whatever you call it, whether it's loss and damage or adaptation support, I think they are coming up with solutions. They are extremely resilient people. So I'm not just looking at from the point of vulnerability, but also from the point of that, if they get some level of tools and support to take on some of these solutions and can scale up with intermediaries, organizations, local organizations, then I think they can adopt a lot better. So I think that part is very, very important. We're not seeing any resourcing, any resources coming in from that perspective.
I think you've really interestingly demonstrated how climate intersects with all sorts of traditional development and humanitarian work. NGOs in the global north haven't been working on this in the same way for as long. What do you think are some of the key lessons that NGOs in the global north should be listening to from BRAC?
I think it's more about the approach we take in terms of coming up with solutions. Our approach is very much embedded from the indigenous community. So solutions are coming from them. It's very much low cost, frugal solutions that really capitalizes on social capital, the community's participation. And every context is very, very different. It's very, very localized as well, right? So it's not something where Something can be designed up for in a room like this, and then that gets airlifted and pushed over there. So I think that is a big fundamental difference. And I think the other thing I would say, that the sustainability of any intervention is thought of from a very early stage, from the design perspective. So that means that whether we as an organization are not there or not doesn't matter, but that we really focus on building the capacity of the local population as well, so that they can take this on themselves once we are gone. So the idea behind the approach is that it's not a charity. It's very much that people are themselves are the change makers. They are making this change. They're extremely resilient and resourceful. They just need some tools to kind of help them do this better in a more effective way.
Which brings us round to the resource point you raised earlier about them kind of not being enough or not accessible, and why that's so important with local ownership. In terms of the resourcing, the climate finance for adaptation, perhaps on loss and damage, what are your hopes for this week? Do you think there is looking like there'll be progress? What would you like to see as a good outcome of these 2 weeks here?
I mean, I think the conversation for me, I think, of course, adaptation is the most important part. As I was saying, that the urgency is very much there, and in the climate financing conversation, the allocation that is there for adaptation is still very limited. So it's about 20%, right? And 80% goes on mitigation, which is important. But I think adaptation needs to go up significantly higher. And even within the 20%, you have 10% going into local organizations, so which is extremely low. And even within local organization, there's a lot of bureaucratic hurdles as well. So for smaller organizations to play a role and to get those resourcing is close to impossible. I mean, we at BRAC started applying for Green Climate Fund about almost 2.5 to 3 years ago, accreditation wise, and the process is still ongoing, and extremely bureaucratic process, right? We had to hire consultants and stuff. I can't imagine that which
takes away from work elsewhere.
Yeah, and there's so how can smaller organizations be able to do that?
Yeah.
So what we have started as an alternative as well, that we partnered with German government to start this fund called Climate Bridge Fund. The bridging as in like also people who are moving, particularly in the urban areas, to support them. The idea behind Climate Bridge Fund is to take out some of this bureaucracy and create, for BRAC being the intermediary, which has institutional muscles and ability to monitor and also do the due diligence that donors want. So we are playing that role. And so we also get local organizations to apply for funding. So it's a very small pot, but the idea, it's about 10 million euro right now. The idea behind it is that we want to show that can be innovative structures where strong organizations can play the role of doing the due diligence for the donors and de-risk it for them, but at the same time support locally led adaptations for smaller organizations. So I think I think from BRAC, what we just don't want to complain about what's not happening. We are also bringing out solutions that needs to be scaled up. So whether it's in low-cost housing, disaster resilient shelters. I mean, there are a lot of these interesting examples that are both coming in from this Climate Bridge Fund, BRAC adaptation from local organizations. So I think those needs to be scaled up very rapidly, and that will require resourcing and resourcing in a way that can be easily managed. So another expectation is that obviously the financing world, this needs to be coming in front and center, and I would say that also continuing with the other conversations that are happening around loss and damage, and obviously that should continue.
And so on the resourcing question, not reaching the 100 billion until potentially 23, who knows what could happen in between now and then? I mean, what sort of impact does that have, on trust in this kind of process from your perspective?
No, I mean, I think the developing countries and stuff, there is a loss of trust because this has not been met. We are very hopeful about the deforestation pledge that all the 130 countries have signed, which is, I think, the one big progress from this summit. But again, something like this was pledged in 2014, I believe, as well. So it really would depend on whether we actually carry forward. I mean, every year we do the COP, but then promises are made. If the promises are not kept, there are a lot of questions, because, even this 100 million, even if it's met by 2023, then there are a lot of questions. What is getting counted as climate aid, right? So we are seeing that also some of the overseas development aid is getting repackaged as finance, climate finance, right? There are a lot of loans that are given in financing-wise. That is also packaged as climate financing. So, but that shouldn't be the case. I think that there should be a lot more transparency about this. Not only promises needs to be kept, but at least a very transparent way of how and who and what is being given. And from a justice perspective, that needs to be very, very clear. And there's the loss of trust has been significant. And I think there needs to be a lot of work needs to be done in the next couple of years to gain back that trust, which is missing right now.
Brilliant. Okay. Asif, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Hi, everybody. We hope you are enjoying the second day of our coverage of Devex at COP26. I'm joined now by Hindu Omar Ibrahim, the president of the Association for Indigenous Women and Peoples of Chad. And Hindu has been a really vocal activist for the voices of indigenous people around the world, and particularly in Africa, in the Sahel, as it relates to the climate crisis. So thank you so much for joining us here today. I'm going to hand you our microphone.
Thanks for having me.
You're most welcome. Hindu, could you tell me first of all a little bit about yourself, and how long have you been advocating for indigenous rights?
Sure. So good morning, everyone. It's really a very long time, I can say, because I started since I was a kid. Yeah. Because for me, it is not an issue of being activist or issue of just like you have to take it as a vocation. No. I'm doing it because I grew up in the communities where they are living depending from the nature, and where the human right is always a big struggle at the communities, and where we are living the climate impact. So I can't tell you like I started 10 years or 20 years. I can say I started for my entire life.
Your whole life journey. Do you think... Thank you. Why is it important then that we're here at the COP in Glasgow, and you're here to represent Indigenous people? There are many other Indigenous representatives from other parts of the world. Why do you think it's important that the COP is an inclusive process that includes the voices of Indigenous people?
I think for the Indigenous peoples around the world, maybe we represent only 5% of the world's populations, but we protect 80% of the world's biodiversity. So I do not see any COP that talking about nature, talking about the peoples who are contributing in nature, without being inclusive to the indigenous peoples, and without that having indigenous peoples sitting the tables and also have their own decisions to be there. Indigenous peoples used to be for so long that they're just victimizing us. We are not the victim. We become the victim because of the inaction of the other peoples who are destroying our land, territories, and resources. We are the champion of the climate. We are the solutions makers. So that's why we also refuse to become a victim. We are the solutions, and our participation is really very important to the successful of the COP.
Thank you. We had another speaker, Salim ul Haq from Bangladesh. Maybe you know him. He's a really interesting phrase. Instead of calling people, climate vulnerable people, he used the phrase "first adapters." Is that something you recognize?
Definitely. I know very well Salim ul Haq is my other brother from Bangladesh. But of course, why they just like put us this name like vulnerables, populations, or impacted or whatever? Even we are the most impacted, but we are the first one who are adapting We do have the knowledge. We didn't ask for anyone. We didn't wait for anyone. We are adapting. Are all indigenous peoples around the world. So definitely, I agree with what Salimul Haq said.
Do you think people in the global north, NGOs, the media need to be a bit more careful about how they refer to communities that are adapting to the impacts of climate change? Is there a bit of a narrative issue that you think needs to change?
I think this narrative must change. Not is have to change. It must change. They have to stop to just babysitting the peoples from the global south, or especially the indigenous communities, saying like, we are there to help you, we are there to work. No, we are there to help you. If we protect 80% of the world's biodiversity, you are not helping us. We are helping you. So it is time that to do it together. We are not asking them to come and just give us the support. We are asking that how we can do this work together, how everyone can take his responsibility. People from the global north, they must take the responsibility to reduce the emissions. They are the one who took us in this pathway of climate impact. So they are also must be the one who will reduce the emissions, who think about their own self. We are impacted, but we are adapting. So they must learn from us. So it is a partnership work. And that's why the naming of negative way have to change. We are the champion and everyone must recognize that.
Do you have some ideas for how indigenous communities and organizations and institutions representing the global north can work together more fairly and in a better way to try and preserve biodiversity in a way that kind of promotes climate justice?
I think the first thing that the global north might do, they must recognize and respect the indigenous people's rights. They must include the human right-based approach in all the climate decision and climate implementation. Because for us, it is not a matter of mitigation, how we can just reduce the carbon and invest in the carbon. It is a matter of adaptation. And when we talk about adaptation, we also talk about the human rights. Right to water, because our water are polluted. Right to clean air, because even the global north have a polluted air where they're breathing. It is a matter of development, because we also deserve to develop, to have our own way of development, not imposed way that's coming from the global north that change all our life. We wanted our own development based on renewable energies, based on traditional knowledge of the indigenous communities, based on family agriculture, sustainable way of living, societal way of sharing, all together supporting each other. So they must understand and put the human rights there. Secondly, they must understand the participation is not meaning just so you call the global south, come and sit down and then the global north take the decisions. No, being partners, it's sitting together, taking the decision together, listening from each other. And that's the global north do not know that, because most of the time at the negotiation, they get the capacity to have all the experts that they want. It's not the case of the global south. The language barriers is not the case. So how they can just sit in the back and have all these communities to be there to get them voice, to listen and implement. And lastly, it is a matter of how we can implement. Implementation needs finance. We are not begging to get the finance. They are the one from the global north who take all the opportunities of the finance to develop themselves. So it is time that they return this finance back to our peoples, to our communities, to help fix the problem that they make. And for that, we do not want to have commitment. We want to have the cash in the tables. We do not want them to set the criteria. They are not holding us, no. They must make this money adapt to our realities. So the money must adapt to us, not we must adapt to the criteria that they put in the money. And then we can be equal and we can start talk together.
So loud and clear, human rights need to be enshrined as part of this process for you, but also the money needs to be accessible. That's a big issue. Absolutely, that's a really big issue that's been talked about a lot by this thing. How have you been impressed, or what have you been impressions of the UK as host of this COP? Do you think they have effectively facilitated participation in a meaningful way? What are your thoughts?
Let me be clear. Let me be clear. After this pandemic, it is the first bigger conference that the world have. So we must all understand UK did them best. Because having the peoples coming from everywhere, wearing the mask, being sure that they are not contaminating each other, being sure that everyone get their place in the room, this is one of the challenging things, and that UK did it. And then they are improving it. So they are the first one, so we cannot blame them. We must help them. However, there is something that they must also improve. Participations. We still have some of the people who didn't get their passport for the visa. They travel, they put all the money, all the energy to get the visa to another country, but 2 months, they didn't get it. For those who get the visa, who come here, all the COVID tests, all the orientation are in English 100%. From the people who speak Spanish, who speak French, how they can just wake up every morning and do the daily test and go through a website who is 100% English and follow the instruction and doing it? I mean, for me, it's difficult. How much for the French speaker, Arabic speaker, Spanish speakers, and it is an inclusive, so it is not only limited to the English peoples. And it is the same when you wanted to ask your way, or when you wanted to book something, when you pass through the airport, everything is not facilitated for the peoples who are coming from the outside, who are not native English speakers. Of course, we understand UK is the mother of English, but we are not. I have my mother tongue. If I take some peoples from UK or US or whatever, I take them to my community, I'm like, be there, sit there. They do not understand my language. They do not understand my culture. I really will love to see their faces, just to be there for 1 day. But we are here for the 2 or 3 weeks for some of us with this struggle. So the next COP must learn from this one in order to improve the inclusiveness. And making inclusiveness is not also limited to those logistics. We have at the negotiations how the inclusiveness must be also open. So the rooms must be biggest, where everyone can have the place to sit, not only having the daily pass. Of course, this one also we understand it is the first one we are making it, but it must be improved better.
So you say you've been a lifelong activist for indigenous rights. Do you think that the perception of indigenous rights is being taken more seriously in this COP and in more recent years? Is the situation better now than it has been, you think, in the past?
So the first recognition is COP21 in Paris, because after 20 years before Paris, there was a struggle of recognition of indigenous people's rights. And for the first time, we got 5 references into the Paris Agreement, from our knowledge to our rights to our participations. This was the beginning. And then we come back progressively to have the local communities and indigenous people's platform that have been implemented with a unique body in all the world, in the UN agencies, where we have the equal representations within this climate change, 7 from the government, 7 from indigenous peoples. Even in the leadership role, we co-chair, and that's why I'm the co-chairs of the facilitative working group for the local communities and indigenous peoples, for the indigenous peoples part. And my other co-chair is from the government, he's from Canada. So then we share this power of discussions, of input as indigenous peoples, all our 7 sociocultural regions. It is a big step too. And we come here in the COP26, we have our negotiations item who already adopted. That's the other good thing. We get the indigenous people's commitment on 1.7 billion for forest and land. This is also a big step. So participation is getting improved. But my issue is, we don't have time. We are in urgency. So we cannot anymore accept the small step. It is important, but we need to do a bigger step. And bigger step mean for me is sitting in the tables, taking the decision together. not just talking from the outside. It is also having the commitment, yes, but turning very quickly the mechanism that can give this direct access to the funding to my mother, to my grandmother, to my cousin, to all the indigenous peoples around the world who are at the communities, who are doing the action. So we cannot wait until the next years to do one mechanism and the another year another one. So we need to do it now, and hopefully by the next COP in my region in Africa, we can come up with a good solutions or with a good improvement of how indigenous peoples are better participating.
Just quickly, very quickly, before we have to go, there's been a lot of talk about loss and damage. Some people say there's been progress around loss and damage. What's your take on that?
For me, the progress in loss and damage must be only if we consider the non-economic loss and damage, because for indigenous peoples, we are losing our identity, our land, our territories, our culture. We are losing the life of our peoples. So those, they cannot pay them. They can put any billions. They cannot pay a life of someone or an identity or an culture. The only way is recognition of the non-economic loss and damage, and to recognize they must act to stop the climate change in order to do not have those losses anymore that causing us pain.
Hindu, that's been really great to hear you talk. Thank you so much for joining us with Devex at COP26, and thank you all for watching.
Wow, what a great conversation to end on, Will. Lots of great conversations today. What have been the highlights for you?
Yeah, it's been fantastic, Kate. Thanks. I think something that has really come out from these conversations, Hindu referred to it just now, Salim ul Haq, Asif Saleh at BRAC, and other speakers around at side events that haven't made it onto Devex's coverage but have been talking here, is a common thread that has united people from Bangladesh, Africa, the Philippines, all over, is that some of the people, in lower income countries worst affected by climate change, they don't like seeing themselves as vulnerable. Salim said he prefers the term first adapters, and I've heard that sentiment reflected a lot from lots of different kind of groups and people all over this COP, which I think has been really interesting to hear, something we can take and we can learn from.
Yeah, well, that was, I think, a concern of our community, is how much the voices of lower middle income countries would be present here. And so what are some of the things you will be following up on, some stories that you're going to be covering to ensure some of these commitments that are happening are actually fulfilled?
Yeah, I think the climate adaptation is going to continue to be such a big issue for the development community. It's going to be such a large element of development finance going forwards. There's been significant progress on the adaptation agenda at this COP. It's been lagging for quite some time. It does feel to have shifted. The US Prepare program with $3 billion for climate adaptation is kind of a testament to that, I think. And we have a few days to go, but it looks like there'll be something pretty good on adaptation in the final text. Watch this space. I'm also interested to kind of follow up on what happens around the loss and damage argument, where we are on Wednesday. That loss and damage has made it into the final cover text, but the language around it is still pretty weak. I don't think that's going to be an issue that goes away anytime soon.
Right, well, we will be covering this and these stories more. Make sure you're subscribed to our newswire to get the latest on that. We also will have some special coverage coming out for our Devex Pros, as well as a special offer. So if you're not already a member, stay tuned. Look out for that in your inbox. Again, I want to thank our partners that help make today possible, our innovation ecosystem partner, DAI UK, as well as our ecosystem partners, AGRA, Catapult, Center for Disease Protection, ESRI, and RTI International, and our underwriter, FHI 360. Thank you to Will and to our colleagues around the world who helped put these 2 days of really fascinating conversation together. And thank you for tuning in. We'll see you in our next event. Thanks.
Thanks, guys.